When it comes to starting seeds, giving each seed the best opportunity to germinate and grow really should be the goal of every gardener. And it starts with the medium that you put the seed into. Join me today as I show you how to make seed starter mix. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I've been using seed starter mixes to start my seeds for many years. Ever since I figured out that, for me, that's the best way to get germination and healthy seedlings. Let's start by talking about the seed itself. It has everything it needs to begin germinating and growing. It's just lacking in oxygen, warmth, and water. So when we supply those three things, the seed will germinate and begin growing. And once it starts growing into a plant, it needs some kind of medium for the roots to grow into. And this is where the key difference between a seed starter mix and a potting soil mix comes into play. The seed, because it has everything it needs to grow into a plant, doesn't need any additional nutrients. It doesn't need fertilizers. Instead, it'll grow best in a nice, loose, moist medium, one that the roots can actually spread out with very little opposition. A potting soil has the nutrients. Typically it has fertilizers, and it tends to be denser and a little chunkier. So when I'm starting my seeds indoors, I want to give that little seed and the initial seedling every chance it can get. So I'm going to give it a nice, loose, moist medium and not worry about the nutrients. Now, I am planning with all of the seeds I start in a seed starter mix to transplant them at some point into a potting mix. You can start seeds directly into a potting mix, and I've done that with hundreds of plants. But because of the density of that potting mix, and because the fertilization might actually be too much, and it could burn and damage the young roots of those seedlings, I found that I just didn't have the same success. I prefer to use a seed starter mix, get the plant started, and then put it into that medium that has the nutrients that it's looking for. Of all the things you'll do in gardening, making your own seed starter mix will be among the easiest. There's only 2 ingredients, maybe 3, and it's not a secret. Even the big manufacturers of seed starter mixes tell you exactly what to put in it. This bag tells you specifically that it's 60% to 70% sphagnum peat moss, vermiculite, coir pith, and lime to adjust the pH. This bag is broken down and says it's a regionally formulated product and may contain compost, forest products, sphagnum peat moss, softwood bark, and perlite. But if you look further, in Georgia, again, it's a blend of 60 to 70% sphagnum peat moss, the forest products, and perlite. So the 2 seed starter options I had at my local store both have 60 to 70% of peat moss. Beyond that, they have a little bit of filler. The one uses cocoa coir, the other uses forest products, and that basically just means it's chopped up wood or bark that is partially decomposed. And then they add an additional ingredient, either vermiculite or perlite. So let's talk about those basic ingredients. It probably comes as no surprise to you that the recipe I use to make my seed starter mix is primarily peat moss and perlite. It's not that I'm copying the manufacturers, it's that those are good ingredients to use. And why is that? Well, peat moss is very effective at holding water. Once it gets moist, it tends to stay moist with very little effort. And that's what the seed needs. It needs a moist environment. But there is a problem of too much water, saturation, and that's where the perlite comes in. Perlite is excellent for drainage. So by blending the peat moss with the perlite, we have a medium that retains moisture, but drains well enough that it's not too much moisture for the young plants. And what's the ratio? Well, you guessed it, 60 to 70% of peat moss. So my recipe is 2 parts peat moss to 1 part perlite. You do have other options. Many parts of the world do not have access to peat moss, or the peat moss that they do have access to is not sustainable. So you could use cocoa coir as a substitute, and many manufacturers are starting to make this shift. The coir is a byproduct of the coconut industry, and those little fibers from the coconut do effectively the same thing that the peat moss does. Once it's wet, it retains moisture very well. So if you use the same basic formula of 2 parts cocoa coir to 1 part of perlite, you'll get very similar results. You could also use vermiculite instead of perlite. Perlite and vermiculite are both inorganic materials that are great for draining. So those 4 ingredients in the same basic combination, the peat moss or cocoa coir, perlite or vermiculite, is really the basis for almost all seed starter mixes. If you choose to go with peat moss, you're going to find it in a bale. Typically it's going to be 2 cubic feet or 3 cubic feet in a compressed bag. You can find the perlite and vermiculite at most nurseries, and typically they're going to come in a bag or a box of about 1 cubic foot. Now, because I make so much seed starter mix and potting mix, I buy from the internet in bulk using these 4 cubic foot bags of both perlite and vermiculite. The cocoa coir is also going to come in a compressed block, and you can get this in a number of different sizes. It might also be sold as cocoa peat because they're attempting to take over the market of peat using the coconut byproduct. This product from Burpee actually labels it as seed starting mix, and it's 100% coconut coir because you can grow in nothing but coir. You can also find pellets made out of peat that are 100% peat moss and grow in those as well. I just like adding the perlite so that I don't get a too saturated environment. The coconut coir does require an additional step. Because this block is dry and compressed, it needs to be rehydrated and expanded before we can use it in any type of mix. And this little block is going to take about 1 gallon of water to fully rehydrate. In just a couple minutes, it's expanded quite a bit. It's soaking up the water, and all these fibers are being rehydrated. In no time at all, the water is completely absorbed, and this is ready to add to a seed starter mix. While both peat moss and cocoa coir are great at retaining moisture, they're both hydrophobic, which means when they're dry, they actually repel water. That's why you need to soak the brick in water so that it has time to absorb all of that moisture. And the same holds true with peat moss. When we use that in a seed starter mix, we need to make sure that we soak the mix with a lot of water because that peat moss is going to take some time to absorb it. But once it does, it's going to hold it quite well. And as I mentioned in the beginning, making the mix is incredibly easy. Note that I didn't give any specific measurements. You don't need to worry about cups or gallons or liters or kilos. Just decide how much you want to make and get a container that big, and then get something that you can use as a scoop to add the ratios of the ingredients. So to make the basic seed starter mix, I use 2 parts of peat moss, and then add 1 part of perlite. And as long as you keep that basic ratio, you can mix things up a little bit. I've put 3 scoops of peat moss in the container. There's number 4. And now I'll add 1 scoop of perlite and 1 scoop of vermiculite. Now, these dry ingredients can get into the air and cause trouble with your lungs. So when I'm making a lot of this, I will wear a dust mask, and I'll put in the single scoop of perlite and the single scoop of vermiculite. And still wearing the dust mask, now I just mix everything together. We want the peat and or core and the perlite and or vermiculite to be well mixed. With everything mixed, I can take off the dust mask unless I see that there's a lot of visible dust in the air. And now we need to add water to rehydrate the peat moss. Just like we had to rehydrate the core, we need to give time for the peat moss to soak up some water. And so with the lid on this bin, after about 5 or 10 minutes, that peat moss will have absorbed all of the water, and this will be ready to use. Now, you may have noticed that I put both peat and core in this bin, and perlite and vermiculite in this bin. Remember that those ingredients are interchangeable. As long as you have that basic ratio of the 2 parts of organic material to 1 part of the inorganic material, you can mix it up however you want. I have found that I like a blend with both the perlite and the vermiculite. So the recipe I use nowadays is 4 parts of peat moss to 1 part perlite and 1 part vermiculite. And you can just as easily interchange with some of the core in place of the peat moss. Now, why am I taking all the trouble to get these big bags and make them mix? Sure, it's easy to put together, but do you really need that much? Well, you're the only one that can answer that question. I start a lot of seeds, and I transplant a lot of plants. So making my own mixes saves me money. My calculations based on the cost of the ingredients in my area show that I can make a seed starter mix for about 25 to 30% of the cost that I would pay if I bought one of those manufacturer's bags. If you're not making as much as I am, well, it might make sense to go ahead and buy a bag of seed starter mix. The ingredients are the same. It's just when you do it in bulk, you can save an awful lot of money. And I'm using these ingredients for more than just the seed starter mix. I'm also going to be using those ingredients to make my potting mix. And you can go ahead and look at this video right here to see how I make that mix. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.